Morgan Freeman stepped onto the plane with his usual quiet grace. His every movement exuded a calm confidence, as though he were just another passenger, but anyone who looked closely would notice the way people's heads turned ever so slightly, as if they couldn't quite believe their eyes for a moment. He walked down the aisle with an air of quiet dignity, his silver hair catching the light above the seats, his familiar voice, nothing more than a distant whisper to those around him. Yet the presence was unmistakable. It was Morgan Freeman, one of the most beloved voices of Hollywood, and yet here he was just another traveler boarding a flight like any other. As he settled into his seat near the back of the plane, his eyes scanned the cabin briefly before he looked down at the window beside him and smiled to himself, a soft smile, as if he were reflecting on something far beyond the confines of the plane itself. His thoughts drifted as the hum of the engines began to fill the space around him, but before he could settle in completely, a voice interrupted his moment of peace. "Good afternoon, sir." The flight attendant's voice was sharp, almost too sharp for someone who should be welcoming passengers with warmth. Morgan looked up and offered a soft but genuine smile, and greeted her in return. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice warm and steady as he always was. The flight attendant, Sarah, gave him a nod, but there was something off about it, something that didn't quite match the usual professionalism he'd come to expect from flight attendants. As she walked away, he noticed how she kept her distance, as if she were purposefully avoiding making eye contact with him. He found it odd but said nothing, simply leaning back in his seat, closing his eyes for a brief moment. As the plane started to fill up with the rest of the passengers, Morgan felt the familiar discomfort of a cramped cabin. But he didn't mind the space. He was used to this. He'd been on many flights over the years, though it always struck him how people behaved when they realized who he was. Some stared too long, some whispered with excitement, but for the most part, he'd become accustomed to it with the years, the constant attention, the constant scrutiny. But Sarah wasn't like the others. It wasn't that she was starstruck, no, she seemed to be almost indifferent to his presence, and that in itself made Morgan uneasy. It wasn't the indifference that bothered him so much as the subtle coldness. He could feel it in the way she moved past him when delivering drinks and snacks, in the way she would give him brief responses when he asked for something as simple as a glass of water. Morgan was no stranger to this kind of treatment. He'd seen it before from people who didn't want to treat him like a person, but instead wanted to treat him as a celebrity, something to be admired, but not interacted with. He knew that feeling all too well, but for some reason this time felt different. He didn't know why, but he felt something stirring inside of him, a quiet irritation that he rarely allowed to rise. When Sarah passed by him for the third time without even offering him eye contact, Morgan's hand shifted slightly, resting on the armrest. He could feel the old frustration beginning to build, but he kept it contained, letting it pass without comment. Instead, he turned his attention back to the window, staring out at the clouds below. It wasn't until the meal cart came through that the tension truly began to mount. Sarah's face seemed to harden as she approached Morgan's seat, and without a word placed a meal tray in front of him. The food was unappetizing at best, the portions were small, and the presentation was lacking. But it wasn't just the food that caught Morgan's attention, it was the way she handed it to him, with no care, as if he were just another seat number, and not a human being sitting there. Morgan glanced down at the meal, and then back at Sarah. Her eyes didn't meet his, they stayed focused ahead. As she moved on to the next passenger, the contrast between the other meals being served and his own was striking. It was clear that something was off, but Morgan didn't say anything, not yet. He sat quietly chewing on his food, though he had little appetite. Now his thoughts were elsewhere. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just bad service, something deeper, something personal. But what was it about Sarah's attitude that was so unsettling, he wondered as the flight continued. The flight continued on as the hours passed by. The tension in the cabin seemed to grow with each minute. Sarah's behavior towards Morgan became more apparent and more difficult to ignore. She moved quickly down the aisle, attending to everyone with a forced cheerfulness that seemed to have no real warmth behind it. Yet, when she reached Freeman's seat, her smile was always more strained, her words clipped as if she were doing him a favor by acknowledging his presence. Morgan watched her every time she came near, and though he tried not to make a scene, he couldn't help but notice how differently she treated him compared to the other passengers. He wasn't the type to make a fuss. He had learned over the years how to let certain things slide and how to let people be who they were, but there was something about the way Sarah was acting that rubbed him the wrong way. He wasn't sure if it was because he was used to being treated with respect, or if it was something else entirely, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just about poor service or a flight attendant having a bad day. There was something more beneath the surface, something personal. It felt like a quiet disregard, as though she resented him simply for being there. As Sarah passed by him again with her usual brisk efficiency, Morgan caught a glimpse of the other flight attendants, chatting near the front of the cabin. They seemed to be laughing and joking with the passengers, as though they were in a completely different world from the one Freeman was occupying, and for a brief moment he wondered if she had been instructed to avoid him, or if it was just her own personal attitude. He tried to dismiss the thought, but it lingered at the back of his mind the whole time. The rest of the flight seemed to pass in a blur of indistinct conversations and quiet murmurs, yet Morgan remained ever so aware of the uncomfortable distance between him and the young flight attendant. He wondered what had happened to the warmth of genuine service, the kind he had always known to expect on flights. At one point, Sarah returned to offer him a drink. She stood there waiting for him to give her his order, but she didn't speak. She simply stared ahead, as if waiting for him to say something first. Morgan felt a flicker of frustration. This wasn't the first time she had done this. It was as if she was hoping he wouldn't ask at all. After a long pause, Morgan finally said softly, "I'd like a glass of water, please," his voice calm. But there was an edge to it this time. His words carried a weight that he hadn't intended to put behind them. But somehow they slipped out just the same. Sarah nodded curtly without acknowledging him further and walked away without a word. The flight was long and uneventful after that, but Morgan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being treated unfairly. He had seen this before. He had felt it before. He knew what it was like to be dismissed because of who you were or because of how others viewed you, but this time it felt different. It felt personal. As the cabin lights dimmed and the plane settled into the quiet hum of the night, Morgan couldn't help but think about the young flight attendant's cold demeanor. What had caused it? Why had she chosen him to target of all people? Surely it wasn't something he had done. Surely he hadn't unknowingly crossed some line. And yet there was something in her eyes, something in the way she avoided his gaze, that made him wonder if the situation had more to do with him than he realized. A ripple of unease washed over him, but he tried to push it aside. He was no stranger to uncomfortable moments, but this one felt different. It was as if there were an unspoken challenge hanging in the air, waiting for him to address it. He leaned back in his seat, staring out the window, the dark sky stretching out before him. And for a moment he allowed his mind to wander. He thought about all the things he had learned over the years about patience and understanding about people and their complexities. And then he thought about Sarah, the flight attendant who seemed to want nothing more than to push him to his breaking point. Could this be more than just a case of bad service? He wondered, what was it that had pushed her to behave this way? Was it something personal, or was it simply an issue of pride? The hours wore on, and though the flight seemed to drag on endlessly, the question remained unanswered. But Morgan Freeman knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't let this moment slide without learning more about the woman who had chosen him to be her target. The flight continued to stretch on as the hours seemed to blend together. The hum of the engines became a constant presence in Morgan's mind, but the discomfort he felt from Sarah's behavior never faded. It lingered in the air around him like a quiet storm waiting to break. His thoughts turned over and over, the same question swirling in his head. Why had she singled him out? What had he done to deserve such treatment? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was simmering beneath the surface, something that had little to do with him personally, but everything to do with her and her own struggles, her own issues. Morgan had been around long enough to recognize when someone was carrying their own burden, and though he had no way of knowing what it was clear that Sarah was hiding something. As the plane passed through thick clouds, the lights in the cabin flickered slightly, and Morgan's mind drifted back to the earlier moments of the flight when he had first noticed the strange behavior, her cold eyes, her forced smile, the way she avoided him, like he was a stranger she hadn't even tried to hide her distaste, which made him wonder if this was something more than a simple case of bad customer service. But what could it be, he thought? Surely she had dealt with celebrities before. Surely she had been trained to offer the same courtesy to everyone, regardless of who they were. And yet she had treated him like an inconvenience, someone whose presence wasn't worthy of respect. But there was more to it than just poor service. There had been a certain hostility in the way she moved around him. It wasn't just indifference, it was something more personal. Morgan tried to focus on something else. He closed his eyes for a moment and imagined the quiet serenity of his own home, the warmth of a familiar space, the comfort of a book in his hands, the calm that had always been his refuge. But even there in the silence, he couldn't escape the feeling that something wasn't right. He could feel it like a shadow at the edge of his mind, something gnawing at him, urging him to pay attention to the signs around him. The meal trays were collected, and as the lights in the cabin dimmed to signal the night, the plane seemed to settle into a quiet lull. The passengers around him leaned back in their seats and closed their eyes, but Morgan remained alert. He couldn't shake the unease he felt about Sarah. He wondered what had caused the anger in her to bubble up, what had made her treat him the way she had. His thoughts were interrupted when Sarah came down the aisle again, this time moving at a faster pace than before. Her eyes met his briefly, but there was no apology in them, no sign of remorse for the way she had treated him earlier. She simply continued on, as though he didn't exist, just another passenger in the sea of faces that made up the flight. Something inside Morgan shifted. He had been patient long enough. He had tried to ignore the simmering tension, but it was time to act, time to address what had been left unspoken, the quiet injustice that lingered between them. He couldn't allow this to continue, not because of his fame or status, but because it was simply the right thing to do. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and measured as he stepped into the aisle, his eyes never leaving Sarah as she moved further down the cabin, her back to him. Now he could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, but he wasn't concerned with them. He was focused on Sarah and the choice she had made to treat him this way. "Excuse me, Sarah." His voice was calm but firm, and it cut through the quiet hum of the cabin like a whisper in the dark. She stopped mid-step, her body tensing, as though she had been caught off guard, and turned to face him, her expression unreadable. But there was a flicker of something behind her eyes, something Morgan couldn't quite place, but he knew it wasn't fear. She turned back slowly, her movements deliberate, as if she were waiting for something, but Morgan didn't let the moment pass. He could feel the weight of the situation building, the tension crackling in the air, as the passengers around him fell silent, watching the scene unfold. "Can we talk for a moment?" Morgan's words were simple, but there was an authority in them that made Sarah hesitate for just a moment longer, and that moment was all he needed to make his next move. Sarah froze as Morgan's voice reached her ears. Her back was still turned, but his words had struck her with a force she hadn't anticipated. It was as if the whole plane held its breath, waiting for her response. For a brief moment, she considered ignoring him, pretending she hadn't heard, but something in Morgan's voice made that impossible. There was an unspoken power behind his calm tone, an authority that came not from his fame, but from something deeper, something that demanded respect. She turned slowly, her movements stiff but controlled, and met his gaze. Her face was neutral, but her eyes betrayed her discomfort. She had expected him to say nothing, to ignore the slight, to let it go as most passengers would have done. But Morgan Freeman was no ordinary passenger. He had seen too much in his life to remain silent when injustice was right in front of him. "Yes," she said, her voice tight with uncertainty. She tried to hide the nervousness in her words, but it was clear Morgan had already sensed it. The tension between them thickened as she stepped closer to him, her mind racing, wondering what he would say next and whether she could deflect the situation before it escalated. Morgan didn't waste time. He had been patient long enough. He wasn't interested in making a scene or embarrassing anyone, but something had shifted inside him. Something had told him that this moment wasn't just about him or Sarah. It was about something far bigger. It was about respect and humanity, and what it meant to treat others with decency. "Why have you been treating me like this?" His voice was quiet but firm. There was no anger in it, no resentment, just an honest question that cut through the air. and hung between them like a fragile thread waiting to break. Sarah's eyes flickered briefly, and then dropped to the floor. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched on longer than either of them expected. The other passengers around them had become aware of the exchange. Some were pretending not to notice, others had already begun to whisper, but Morgan paid no attention to them. He was focused entirely on Sarah and the look in her eyes. For the first time since he had boarded the flight, Morgan saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a fleeting moment of vulnerability, something he hadn't expected to see. And for a moment he wondered if maybe he had misunderstood her, if perhaps there was more to this than simple rudeness. But before he could finish that thought, she spoke. "I'm sorry." Her voice was small, almost inaudible, and for a moment Morgan thought he hadn't heard her right. But when she looked back up at him, her face was flushed with shame, and her shoulders had slumped slightly as if she had been carrying a burden for far too long, and had finally let it go. Morgan's expression softened slightly. He could see the guilt in her eyes now, and it wasn't the kind of guilt that came from a simple mistake. It was deeper than that. It was the kind of guilt that came from years of something unspoken, something unresolved. And as he looked at her, he realized she wasn't just apologizing for the treatment she had given him. She was apologizing for something far more personal. He didn't press her, though he could feel the weight of her words as they hung in the air between them. Instead, he nodded slightly, his voice calm as he spoke. "It's okay, we all have our days." He said the words simple, but with a quiet understanding that seemed to surprise her. Sarah stood there for a moment as if weighing his words. Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time since they had met she seemed to truly see him, not as a celebrity, not as an inconvenience, but as a person, as someone worthy of the same respect she would give anyone else, and something in her seemed to shift. "I don't know what's gotten into me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The confession was raw and honest, and Morgan could hear the vulnerability in her words. I've been angered for so long, and I didn't know how to deal with it." Her eyes welled up slightly, and she quickly blinked them away as though ashamed of the emotion she was showing. Morgan remained quiet. He had learned over the years that sometimes the best thing you could do was simply listen, and in that moment he did just that. He listened to Sarah's words and allowed her to continue speaking without interruption. "I'm sorry for treating you like that," she said, finally looking up at him, her face red with embarrassment. But there was sincerity in her voice this time, and Morgan could see that the apology was genuine. The tension in the cabin had lifted, but a new kind of stillness filled the space between them now. A quiet understanding had been reached, and though no more words were exchanged in that moment, Morgan knew that this was a turning point for both of them. The silence between them stretched out for a moment longer as Sarah stood there, her body tense, as if unsure of how to proceed, the weight of the apology still hanging in the air. The passengers around them had returned to their own quiet worlds, but the energy in the cabin had shifted. It was no longer the same as before now. There was a sense of understanding. Something deeper had happened between them, and though it was subtle, it was undeniable. Morgan sat back in his seat, his eyes still on Sarah. Though his expression had softened, he had expected many things from this encounter, but what had just unfolded surprised him. It was rare to see someone open up so completely like that, to lay their burden bare, and in a way it was something he respected. He knew what it was like to carry a weight and to pretend it didn't exist, but it was harder to live that way than to face it head-on. After a long pause, Sarah nodded her head slowly as if to herself before she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "I've been through a lot lately, and it's been hard for me to let go of the anger I've been holding on to. It's been building up for months, and I've just been keeping it inside." Morgan nodded slowly, understanding that pain wasn't always something you could see from the outside. It wasn't always obvious, but it could manifest in small ways, sometimes in the way people treated others, sometimes in the way they avoided their problems rather than confronting them head-on, and he knew that well. "You don't have to apologize for that." Morgan's voice was steady and calm as he spoke, his words meant to reassure her, but also to remind her that she wasn't alone in this struggle. "We all carry things that we're not proud of, but it's how we choose to deal with them that matters." Sarah looked at him with wide eyes, as if his words had cut through something deep within her. It wasn't just about the apology anymore. It was about something more profound, a shift in the way she viewed herself and the way she viewed the world around her. For the first time since the flight had begun, Sarah allowed herself to fully take in what Morgan was saying. His words weren't just a passing kindness. They were a reminder that everyone had a story and that everyone deserved to be treated with respect, even when things were tough. She took a deep breath, and as she exhaled, she seemed to relax a little. Her shoulders dropped, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Sarah smiled, a small but genuine smile, one that reached her eyes and lit up her face. It wasn't a perfect smile, but it was real, and it felt like a weight had been lifted. Morgan returned the smile, his face softening with the understanding that only comes from life experience and time spent learning what truly matters, the things that really make a difference, the moments when you connect with someone on a deeper level and help them see themselves in a new light. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice still quiet but filled with sincerity. "I don't think I could have done this if you hadn't said something, if you hadn't just been patient with me." She paused for a moment, as if reflecting on the kindness that had been extended to her, and then added, "I've been so caught up in my own anger that I didn't even realize what I was doing to others." Morgan's eyes softened even more as he spoke. "Sometimes we all get caught up in things that weigh us down, and it's easy to forget that the people around us are dealing with their own struggles too." He looked around the cabin and saw the passengers still lost in their own worlds, and he couldn't help but wonder how many of them were dealing with things they kept hidden. The plane continued its journey through the night, and though the moment between them had passed, there was a lingering sense of peace that filled the air. Sarah seemed more at ease now, and Morgan could feel the tension that had once been there melting away as the flight continued onward. They both understood something more than they had before. They weren't just two strangers in an airplane anymore. They had shared something real, something vulnerable, and in that shared space, they had both been changed in ways that could not be undone. As the hours stretched on, the hum of the plane became a constant background noise in the cabin. But for Morgan and Sarah, the world around them seemed to quieten, as if it had faded into the distance, leaving just the two of them in a bubble of understanding. The weight of their conversation still lingered, but it felt lighter now, like the air after a storm had passed. Sarah moved down the aisle a little more freely now, her steps less hurried than before. She paused briefly at the back of the plane near the galley, and Morgan noticed her glance over at him for just a moment. He gave her a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the change that had taken place between them, and for a second he saw her smile again, this time a little wider than before. She was different now. He could see that in the way she carried herself. The tension that had once seemed to cling to her like a second skin had dissipated, and though there was still a certain guardedness in her demeanor, it wasn't the same coldness that had been there before. There was warmth in her eyes and a softness to her expression. Morgan turned his attention back to the window. Once more the clouds outside had parted, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a soft light over the endless expanse of darkness. It was beautiful and serene, and for a moment he allowed himself to just sit in the quiet of the night, letting the peacefulness wash over him. But even in that silence, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment, not for himself, but for Sarah. She had opened up in a way that few people ever did, and it had taken real courage. As the plane cruised through the night, Morgan's mind wandered to his own life, to the many moments he had spent reflecting on his own choices, his own actions, the times when he had let anger and frustration rule over him. But he had learned to let go of those things with time, to forgive himself for the mistakes he had made, and to move forward without carrying unnecessary weight. He thought about the many people he had met over the years, the countless faces he had encountered both on and off the screen, but none had ever quite had the same effect on him as Sarah had in that moment. There was something real about her, something human that connected with him on a level he hadn't expected. Sarah came back down the aisle a little later, her steps slower this time. As she approached Morgan's seat, she stopped briefly beside him, her eyes meeting his for a moment before she spoke. "I just wanted to say thank you again," she said, her voice quieter this time, but there was no hesitation in her words. Morgan smiled at her gently. "You don't need to thank me," he replied, his tone calm but sincere. "Sometimes all it takes is someone to listen and be patient with you." She nodded but didn't move away. Instead, she seemed to linger for a moment, as if unsure whether to say something else, or simply leave it there. Finally, she spoke again. "I've been a flight attendant for years, but I've never had a moment like this before, not with someone like you." She paused as though considering her next words carefully. "I guess I always thought people like you were different in a way I couldn't relate to." Morgan raised an eyebrow in curiosity, but he said nothing. He simply waited for her to continue. Sarah's voice softened. "I thought people in your position had it all figured out, that you never had to deal with the things we do in the real world. But I see now I was wrong." She smiled faintly. "I've learned more from you in this one flight than I ever thought I would." Morgan regarded her with a quiet smile. "No one has it all figured out, Sarah," he said, his voice full of the wisdom that came from years of experience. "We all have our struggles. We just find different ways of dealing with them. But the most important thing is to keep moving forward and not let the past hold you back." She looked down at the floor for a moment, as if his words had struck a chord with her. Then slowly, she looked back up at him and gave a small but genuine smile. "Thank you," she said, this time with more confidence. Morgan nodded in return, and as he did, he noticed the way she carried herself now, the way she had shed some of the layers of defensiveness she had built up over the years. He knew that change wasn't instant, but in that moment he could see it happening right before his eyes. Sarah moved on to the next row of passengers as the flight continued toward its destination, and Morgan leaned back in his seat once more, but he didn't close his eyes this time. He simply stared out at the endless sky outside and allowed himself a small sigh of contentment, knowing that sometimes the smallest moments could lead to the most profound changes. The hours passed quietly as the flight neared its final destination. The cabin lights flickered on, signaling that they were beginning their descent, and for the first time since the flight had begun, the atmosphere felt calm. There was no tension, no awkwardness, just a sense of peace that seemed to settle over the passengers. Even Sarah, who had been walking briskly up and down the aisle earlier, now moved with a sense of ease. Her smile had returned, and it was no longer forced. Morgan glanced around the cabin as the seatbelt sign illuminated and people began to adjust for landing. He noticed that many of the passengers had their heads down, either asleep or lost in their own thoughts. But there was something different about this moment. Something that felt like a new beginning. The soft hum of the engines mixed with the faint murmurs of the cabin crew as they made their final preparations. But even in that mundane moment, Morgan couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had happened between him and Sarah, something that went beyond their brief conversation. He thought about how quickly things could change, how quickly people could go from strangers to sharing something real and profound in just a few moments, a few words exchanged in a space as confined as an airplane cabin, and yet it had felt like a lifetime of change had occurred in the span of a few hours. Sarah came down the aisle one more time, but this time her presence was different. She moved with a calm grace, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders. Her eyes met Morgan's for a brief second, and this time there was no hesitation in her gaze. She nodded at him, acknowledging the quiet bond that had formed between them during the flight. "Almost there," she said with a smile, and Morgan could see the genuine warmth behind her words this time. "Yes, it seems so," he replied, his voice calm and steady as always, but there was a new sense of familiarity in it, a new connection. She stopped for just a moment, as if weighing whether to say something more, but instead she simply nodded once again and moved to the next row of passengers, this time with a slight spring in her step. Morgan leaned back in his seat, watching the ground grow closer through the window, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to simply relax. There was no pressing agenda, no looming responsibilities, just the quiet hum of the world outside and the steady rhythm of the plane descending toward the earth. He thought back on everything that had happened in the last few hours, and as he did, he realized that he had learned something too, something about himself and about how we interact with others, how easy it is to assume things about people without truly understanding their story, but also how powerful it can be when we take a moment to see beyond the surface and truly listen. It wasn't just about the apology from Sarah. It was about the way they had both come to understand one another in that brief time. It was about the humanity they had shared in that confined space, a space where so many people might have just passed each other by without ever really noticing or connecting. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, and the cabin suddenly felt alive again. As the passengers prepared to exit, there was a flurry of activity as people gathered their belongings and made their way to the exits, but Morgan remained seated for a moment longer, taking in the final moments of the flight. There was a quiet satisfaction in him as he realized how much he had taken from this experience. Despite the distance between them, he had formed a connection with Sarah, something real and meaningful. He slowly stood up as the seatbelt sign turned off, and he gathered his things before making his way toward the front of the plane. As he walked down the aisle, he saw Sarah again, this time as she was helping a passenger with their luggage. She looked up and met his eyes for a brief second, and this time there was no need for words. Their shared moment had been enough. Morgan smiled to himself as he passed her and continued toward the exit, and as he stepped off the plane, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace, knowing that sometimes it was the quiet moments that made all the difference. As Morgan walked through the terminal, he could still feel the remnants of the conversation with Sarah lingering in the air. It was as if the exchange had set something in motion, something he couldn't quite explain, but something that had shifted within him. Perhaps it was the way she had let go of her anger, or how he had been able to offer her that small moment of understanding that made all the difference. Perhaps it was the quiet realization that even the smallest interactions could have a lasting impact on someone's life. He made his way toward the baggage claim area, his mind still reflecting on the flight he had just experienced. As he stood there waiting for his luggage, he couldn't help but notice the people around him, each one lost in their own world, hurrying to their next destination. Yet something about it all felt different to him today. He could see their faces more clearly, the way they moved, the way they looked at each other, and he realized that in some small way he was more aware of them than he had been before. As the carousel began to turn, he grabbed his bag and slowly made his way out of the airport. A sense of calm washed over him. Now that he was back on solid ground, the noise of the terminal faded behind him, replaced by the steady rhythm of his footsteps on the pavement. He took a deep breath as he stepped outside, the cool night air filling his lungs. There was something refreshing about it, something grounding after the long flight, and the emotions it had stirred within him. He glanced up at the sky, the same sky that had been above him during the flight. But somehow it felt different now, perhaps because he had seen it through a different lens, a lens that allowed him to appreciate the quiet beauty in things he might have overlooked before. As he walked toward the car waiting for him, he couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter with Sarah had been more than just a random event. It had been a moment that had connected them both on a deeper level, and though they would never see each other again, that small exchange would stay with him for a long time. Later that evening, as he sat in his quiet home, he thought back to the flight and the conversations that had unfolded. He thought about the way people often overlook the struggles of others, assuming that everyone had it all together, that the world was a simple place with no hidden depths. But he knew better. He knew that everyone carried something inside them, even the people who appeared to have it all figured out. And sometimes all it took was a kind word or a moment of patience to help someone realize that they weren't alone in their struggles. He smiled to himself as he sat back in his chair. There was no grand lesson to be learned, no earth-shattering revelation, just the simple truth that sometimes we don't know what others are going through, but we can always offer them a little bit of kindness, a little bit of understanding. The phone buzzed on the table, breaking his thoughts. It was a message from his assistant asking about the next day's schedule, but for a moment he didn't rush to respond. Instead, he sat there, allowing the stillness to settle around him, letting the warmth of the evening wrap him up in quiet peace. He had learned something valuable on that flight, something that couldn't be bought or taught in any classroom. It was the simple power of human connection, and the way it could change lives even in the smallest of moments. With a final deep breath, he stood up from his chair, walked to the window, and looked out at the darkened city below him, the lights twinkling like stars in the distance, and he felt content. He didn't need anything more than this small moment of peace, this understanding that even in the chaos of the world it was possible to find connection and meaning. As he turned away from the window and walked toward his bedroom, He felt a sense of gratitude for everything that had brought him to this point, for the people he had met along the way, for the lessons they had taught him, and for the quiet moments that made it all worth it.